The One and Only Cynthia Jane Thornton by Claudia Mills. Copyright 1986. Chapter 1. Cynthia had never signed an oath in blood before. Tense and rigid, she sat sideways on the window seat in the upstairs tower room, bracing her feet against the alcove wall. With the sharp tip of the needle she poked tentatively at the soft, fleshy pad of her index finger. It didn't hurt if she tapped very lightly, but she'd never make it bleed that way. She prodded a little harder. Ouch! It hurt that time. No blood came out. She squeezed her finger hopefully, just in case. Not a drop. Outside the window, late afternoon sun trickled through the branches of the maple tree. Cynthia had written a poem about late afternoon sun, spread thick and golden on the grass like honey. Mrs. Solomon had read it aloud to the class that morning as an outstanding example of a simile. But that was before Mrs. Solomon had become her enemy. Thinking of the fifth-grade teacher gave Cynthia a sudden burst of courage. There! She jabbed the needle in, hard, and a bright bead of blood appeared. The more she squeezed, the bigger it got. Quickly she snatched up her oath and began tracing a blurry-looking C at the bottom. She could tell that she'd have to make several pricks to get enough for her blood for her full signature, so she contented herself with her initials, CJT. The blood dried a rusty brown, so maybe no one would believe it was blood at all, but it was real human blood, and it meant that she had to keep the oath, no matter what. She read over what she had written. I, Cynthia Jane Thornton, do hereby swear that I will never again say a single word in Mrs. Solomon's class, unless I am called on, and then only the minimum number of words possible. The purpose of the oath was to punish Mrs. Solomon, who thought Cynthia talked too much. Mrs. Solomon had said so in front of the whole class that very afternoon. She had said, Cynthia, why don't you see if you can go 5 minutes without talking? Well, Cynthia had gone a full hour and 23 minutes until the closing bell, and now she was going to go on for the rest of the year, which was a long, long time since it was only the second week in September. Actually, Mrs. Solomon had said something else, too. She had said, I'm surprised you don't get tired of the sound of your own tongue wagging. That was the real reason Cynthia had to make such a sweeping vow and sign it in such a solemn way. Mrs. Solomon had implied that other people were tired of the sound of Cynthia's tongue wagging, and since a tongue doesn't make any sound wagging, she meant that other people were tired of hearing Cynthia talk. She meant, when you came right down to it, that Cynthia was boring. Boring. Cynthia? She felt as if she had been slapped. She couldn't think of a more terrible thing to say to someone. And it was so untrue. Cynthia was certainly the most interesting person in the fifth-grade class. Who was already the star of the top reading group? Who was the star in social studies as well? Who wrote the best stories, poems, and plays? Cynthia Jane Thornton, that's who. The class would be dead, dead, dead if she stopped talking, which was just what she had sworn to do in blood. Cynthia squeezed out one last drop and contemplated it proudly. Your finger's bleeding, her sister Lucy said, coming into the tower room and perching herself on the heavy oak table that stood next to the window seat. I know it is. I stuck it. Why? Because. She wanted to tell Lucy that she had stuck her finger. She felt like bragging about it to someone, but she didn't want to tell her anything more. Because why? I wanted to see what kind of blood I have. If it's red, I'm descended from the common people. If it's blue, I'm descended from nobility. You made that up. I've never seen anyone's blood come out blue. It's very rare, Cynthia said. I think just 2% of the population has blue blood. Here, do mine. Lucy stuck out her finger. If mine's red, yours is red too. We have all the same ancestors. Unless one of us is secretly adopted. If one of us is adopted, we both are. They look too much alike not to be sisters, with the same straight blonde hair, blue-gray eyes, pointy chins, and pug noses. It didn't help that their mother made them dress alike either. The only difference was that Cynthia was 1 year and 3 days taller and wore glasses, and Lucy was always quiet, and Cynthia was always talking, except now in Mrs. Solomon's class, where she would be quieter than Lucy ever had been. Cynthia picked up her notebook from the pile of schoolbooks on the floor and casually tucked her oath inside. Lucy had a notebook just like it, a sturdy bound book with a black marbled cover. Cynthia's notebook was for her poetry, because she was going to be a poet. Lucy's notebook was for her astronomy, because she was going to be an astronomer. It was easy to tell the notebooks apart. Lucy's had small gold foil stars all over it. Cynthia had drawn a poetic looking wreath of flowers on hers, forming an enchanted garland around her name. "Did you find out what we're having for dinner?" Cynthia asked, hugging her notebook to her chest. "Guess." "Frozen chicken pot pie." Lucy shook her head. "Frozen beef pot pie? Frozen turkey pot pie? Frozen elephant pot pie?" Lucy kept shaking her head. "I give up then. What is it?" "Frozen vegetarian pot pie." "You mean frozen pot pie with all the mushy, gushed together vegetables and no meat at all?" "It's new. The company just started making it. It's like, an experiment." "An experiment," Cynthia repeated glumly. "So we're like guinea pigs." Lucy's tone was so matter of fact that suddenly both girls began shrieking with laughter. Still clutching her notebook, Cynthia staggered over to the battered daybed that served as a couch for the tower room, and threw herself face down on the rumpled quilts. Lucy, who cried when she laughed, wiped tears away with her sleeve. For as long as the girls could remember, Mrs. Thornton had been taking courses to get her state certification to teach elementary school, and there had always been a lot of frozen pot pies toward the end of each semester. Now she was busy with her first full-time job, and there were frozen pot pies every night. Mr. Thornton commuted an hour and a half each way to his job at a bank in the city, so he got home too late to help with dinner. Cynthia didn't mind too much about the pot pies. It could have been so much worse. Her mother could have gotten a job at Middlebrook School, a possibility that had kept Cynthia in terror for months. It was bad enough having her look-alike, dressed-alike sister trailing along a year behind, but it would definitely cramp her style if her mother and her teacher had lunch together every day. Luckily, Mrs. Thornton had been offered a job in a neighboring town. "I wish she'd let us cook," Lucy said when they had recovered from laughing. "We could ask." Cynthia sounded doubtful. "But then she'd think we didn't like the pot pies." "Of course we don't like them. We hate them." They started laughing hysterically again. It unsettled other people, particularly their parents, when they laughed like that. Other people could never tell what was supposed to be so funny. But it was hardly ever any one thing that was funny. It was everything, the sum total of everything in the world put together. "Girls!" Their mother's voice wafted up 2 floors from the kitchen. "Dinner!" "Don't make me laugh again about the pot pie," Lucy said. "I won't," Cynthia promised. "It'll be hard enough eating it." They managed not to laugh during dinner, except once when Mr. Thornton speared an overripe cherry tomato in his salad and a pocket of slippery seeds flew across the table, landing in Lucy's milk with a splash. Even then they did their best to store it up for later. Actually, the vegetarian pie wasn't as bad as it might have been. At least it didn't have eggplant in it. "How was school?" Mr. Thornton asked, once Lucy's milk had been replaced with a fresh glass. "Fine," Cynthia said. "Quiet." "Quiet?" he asked. "It's hard for me to imagine any class with you in it as quiet." Wait and see, Cynthia thought. Live and learn. "Mine's okay," Lucy said, "but math's boring." "I thought that was your favorite," Mrs. Thornton said. "We're doing long division, and I already know long division. And next is fractions, and I already know fractions." "You know everything about long division?" Mrs. Thornton asked. "There's not much to know. Once you know how to do it for one number, you can do it for every number in the world. It's always the same." "I suppose that's true," Mrs. Thornton said. "I never thought of it that way." "How was Michael today?" Cynthia asked. Michael Bailey was the bad boy in her mother's fifth-grade class. "Disruptive. Halfway through the spelling test, he threw the window pole out the window." "That seems a very particular thing to do," Mr. Thornton said. "He's a very particular boy. Then I made the mistake of sending him down to retrieve it. You wouldn't believe the antics and the carrying on." "What kind of antics?" Cynthia asked eagerly. "Oh, pretending it was a javelin, then trying to pole vault with it, that sort of thing." "He was punished afterward, I take it," Mr. Thornton said. "I tried, but it was a failure. You can't punish a child like that. Punishment is one more form of attention, and that's what he thrives on." "What did you do?" Cynthia asked, trying to imagine her mother in Mrs. Solomon's role. "I drew a little chalk circle on the blackboard and told him he had to stand with his nose in it for half an hour." "You what?" Mr. Thornton asked. "One of my teachers once did that to me, and I remember it was effective then. But it certainly wasn't this time. Girls, I don't see what's so funny. Girls, not at the table." "May we be excused?" Cynthia squeaked through spasms of laughter. Mr. Thornton nodded, and they fled upstairs to bury their faces in their pillows and scream. Cynthia stayed in the tower room when Lucy went back downstairs to watch the TV news for her current events homework. The tower room was the best room in the house. It was really in a tower, and to reach it you had to climb a special flight of narrow, worn stairs. It was hexagon-shaped, and 5 of the 6 walls had windows. Both girls had wanted it for their room when the Thorntons moved to Poplar Avenue 3 years ago, and so they shared it as a playroom. Lucy liked to turn off all the lights and look out at the stars, and Cynthia liked to write her poems there, preferably at sunset, when the sky through the western windows was filled with scudding pink and gold clouds. Today she was writing a poem about her oath. It went like this: Her face grew pale, she seized the pen, and violently she stuck it in, and on her own heart's blood she swore to silent be forevermore. The verses about Solomon's misery and repentance she'd save for tomorrow. It was one of Cynthia's best poems ever, and she copied it carefully on a fresh page in the notebook where she had hidden the oath when Lucy came in. Cynthia never used to hide things from Lucy, and she felt a little surprised at how readily she had come up with the fib about the red blood and the blue blood. It was true that hers was a secret oath, but it wasn't so secret that the whole 5th grade wouldn't know about it by tomorrow. So why not let Lucy know too? Cynthia didn't have a good answer for that one, but lately she felt that being sisters was like being 2 peas squashed together in a very cramped pod. One time she snubbed Lucy for the rest of the day after a well-meaning stranger asked them in a grocery store, "Are you 2 twins?" As if one twin could be 4 inches taller than the other. As if a sensitive-looking poet and a sensible-looking scientist could be twins. Even the principal's confusion bothered Cynthia these days. Mr. McGuire knew that there was a good sister, Lucy, and a bad one, Cynthia, but half the time he called them by the wrong names. The girls walked to school together, played together after school, whispered together from room to room in bed at night, but the 5th grade class was Cynthia's own private world, where she was class poet, class talker, extremely interesting and utterly unique. And she didn't have to share any of it with Lucy if she didn't want to. The phone rang, which made Cynthia feel nervous. Calls hardly ever came for Cynthia on school nights, but sometimes, once in a terrible while, there were calls about her. Last year the 4th grade teacher, Mr. Taylor, had called home several times, and he never called just to talk or to volunteer anything nice about Cynthia. It was too early in the school year for Mrs. Solomon to be calling. Still, Cynthia waited uneasily for a few minutes just in case. "Cynthia!" How could it be Mrs. Solomon already? What had she done that was so bad except talk out of turn a few times? Cynthia walked downstairs slowly, thinking baleful thoughts about her teacher. She found the others assembled in the living room. "That was Mr. Taylor," Mrs. Thornton announced. Mr. Taylor was Lucy's teacher now. Cynthia shot a puzzled look at her sister, because 1, Lucy never gave so much as a peep in class, and 2, everyone looked pleased and excited. When Mr. Taylor called last year, her mother had been close to tears. "He said Lucy seems to be about a year ahead of the rest of the class in math, which explains why she's been finding it so boring lately. So he suggested that she join your class, Cynthia, for math and science too. Usually he's reluctant to push children a grade ahead, but he said that this time it should work out well since you can help her get adjusted and make friends. Won't that be so nice for both of you?" Cynthia stared in horrified disbelief. No, it would not be nice, not even one tiny bit nice. In fact, it would be hard to think of anything less nice. "I guess so," she said coldly. "You don't mind, do you?" Lucy asked, as if Cynthia would say how she really felt in front of the grown-ups. No, why should I care? She said. Why should she care? Only because everything was ruined now, totally and completely ruined. Chapter 2. On the way to school the next morning, Cynthia practiced her vow by stalking along next to Lucy in freezing silence. She knew the new arrangement wasn't Lucy's idea, but she could tell that Lucy didn't mind joining Cynthia's class. She only minded that Cynthia minded. You do mind, I know you do, Lucy had said the night before when they were safely upstairs together, brushing their teeth before bed. So, Cynthia had spat toothpaste into the sink, a hard, fierce peppermint spit that should have made her feel better, but didn't. It's still going to happen, whether I mind or not. Don't you mind, too? Lucy had nodded uncertainly. Maybe if we told the Groans, they'd make it so I went to a different class instead. Fifth grade is fifth grade. It doesn't have to be your class. You know what they'd say. Try it for a few days and see how it works out. Well, maybe it will work out. Cynthia had glared at her, and Lucy had understood. It wasn't going to work out, not if Cynthia had anything to say about it. A block before school, Cynthia's friend Joanne fell in step with him. Hi, you two, she said. It sounded like an Indian name. You two, the two who go together. If Lucy hadn't been there, Cynthia would have told Joanne right away about the vow taken in blood. But of course Lucy was there. So they talked about baseball, which Joanne liked the way Lucy liked astronomy and Cynthia liked writing. Joanne and Cynthia talked about baseball, and Lucy didn't talk about anything. At the playground, the sisters separated, and Cynthia grabbed Joanne's arm. I have to show you something. Drawing her over to a corner, she opened her notebook to reveal the vow. That's real blood, even though it doesn't look like it. It's my blood, from this finger. She held it up. The prick mark was still visible. You'll talk by 9:30, Joanne predicted. Maybe by 9. Cynthia clamped her lips together and shook her head. Meg! Joanne called to a tall, skinny girl in striped overalls. Cynthia's never going to talk again. Cynthia unclamped her lips. In class, unless I'm called on. Meg's eyes sparkled. She loved any kind of scene or spectacle and was always suggesting ridiculous stunts for other people to carry out. Why, unless you're called on? She asked. Why not never, ever? Cynthia thought it over. If she refused to answer any questions, Mr. Solomon would either think she didn't know the answers or else get very suspicious very soon. But so what, really? It would be clear enough from all her tests and written work that she did know the answers, and Mr. Solomon was bound to get very suspicious very soon anyway. Never ever, Cynthia said recklessly. Too late. In a flash of rage, she remembered Lucy. Mr. Solomon's usual practice in math was to go around the room, asking everyone a question in turn. From now on, Lucy would be there, hearing every answer Cynthia gave or didn't give. Well, except in math. She hadn't signed never ever in blood. And except in reading, and except in social studies, and except whenever Mr. Solomon wants you to talk, Meg taunted. No! Meg wouldn't understand how Lucy's being there made such a big difference. It wasn't as if Lucy would tell at home or that she'd dare tease afterwards. It was just that she'd know, and Cynthia would know that she knew. Never ever, she said, giving up. Meg cackled with glee. Solomon'll just croak. She'll be sorry she picked on you yesterday, that's for sure, Joanne said. Cynthia felt excited about the vow again. If you last, Meg added, and she and Joanne exchanged skeptical glances. The bell rang and Cynthia's lips clamped shut again, this time for real. With the boys pushing and shoving at the back of the line, Mr. Solomon's fifth grade marched upstairs. Cynthia stood with the others for the flag salute, but she didn't even move her lips during the pledge. Last night she had been worried about this. What if it was against the law not to pledge allegiance? But then she had remembered the Jehovah's Witness boy in Lucy's class last year who refused to say the pledge because of his religion. Nothing had happened to him, and a vow in blood was enough like a religion that probably nothing would happen to Cynthia either. Still, she felt relieved when it was over and she was safely in her seat again. The first subject of the day was social studies. That year they were going to work their way through every state in the Union, grouped in batches by region. New England was the first region, and today they were doing Vermont. Have any of you been to Vermont? Mrs. Solomon asked. Cynthia's left hand clutched her right hand firmly, so it wouldn't fly up into the air and flail about. Yes, she had been to Vermont just last summer, and she had many interesting things to report about it. She and Lucy had eaten maple sugar boys, and bought penny candy in a real old-fashioned general store, and climbed all the way up a mountain to the very top. Instead, Andy McLean waved his hand and was called on. "What did you see in Vermont?" Mrs. Solomon asked. "Nothing. We were driving through it to get to Maine, and it was after dark, and I slept the whole way." The rest of the class laughed, and Mrs. Solomon laughed too. "Anyone else?" Cynthia thought about the chipmunks Lucy had fed from her hand in one cool Vermont forest, and the town where every single house was freshly painted white and the sidewalks were made of marble. But she kept her hand in a tight ball in her lap. She checked the big clock over the blackboard. It was 9:15. She had kept her vow for 15 minutes so far. Reading group was even harder than social studies. There were only 8 people in Cynthia's group, the fast group, and Cynthia, in her own opinion at least, was the fastest of the fast. She certainly was the one who had the most to say about the stories they read. But today she said nothing, and the time dragged. The others weren't used to having a whole half hour to fill on their own, with no help from Cynthia, and there were a couple of awkward silences in between the comments offered by Doug Meltzer and Melissa Hartman, the two next smartest. During one long pause, Mrs. Solomon looked straight at Cynthia. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked. Cynthia nodded. Mrs. Solomon was clearly puzzled, and Cynthia turned around in her chair to telegraph a smile of triumph to Meg and Joanne. While the other reading groups met, Cynthia used her silent reading time for silent reading, instead of whispered conversations with her neighbors. She was surprised at how much she could read in an hour when she sat there and really read. She had finished 3 chapters of Anne of Green Gables and was lost in a fourth when Doug tapped her on the shoulder. "Hey, Cynthia, do you know what time it is?" She glanced at her watch unthinkingly and was about to say 10:30 when she caught Doug's sly grin. By now the whole class knew about the vow, and the boys, of course, would try to trick her into breaking it. Cynthia pointed at the big clock without uttering a syllable and turned back to Anne. "Cynthia!" Andy McLean hissed from the back of the room. "Oh, Cynthia!" She didn't look up from her book. "I wrote a poem about you. Do you want to hear it? Your eyes are like stars that guide wandering ships. Your nose is like a faucet. It drips." The silent readers cracked up. Mrs. Solomon whirled around from the reading group circle. "Andrew, do you know what silent reading is?" When Mrs. Solomon turned her back again, Doug laid a piece of plastic vomit on the open pages of Anne of Green Gables. Cynthia had seen it being furtively passed across the room from Andy to Doug by a chain of conspiring boys. It was too repulsive to ignore, so trying not to gag, she lifted the book and tilted the vomit onto the floor. Doug picked it up and pretended to eat it. Cynthia gave no sign of noticing. She didn't speak a word through art class, and then it was lunchtime at last. Cynthia accepted Meg's and Joanne's congratulations on the way to the cafeteria. "Solomon won't be able to take it much longer," Meg said. "Andy's terrible," Joanne giggled. "I think he likes you, Cynthia." Cynthia had planned on talking nonstop at lunch, to store it up like a sweet rainwater against the long drought of the silent afternoon. But the prospect of math filled her with such dread that she didn't feel like talking any more. She saw Lucy across the lunchroom, wearing the same blue corduroy jumper, the same blue and white checked shirt, the same white knee socks, the same brown shoes. In another hour Lucy would be in Cynthia's class. It would be like having 2 Cynthias in a world just big enough for one. After lunch, Mrs. Solomon passed out yellow-lined paper for a spelling test. As she wrote down imaginary and volcano, Cynthia's stomach began to hurt. Her throat hurt, too. Maybe she should go to the school nurse. Maybe the nurse would call her mother at work and she would go home in time to miss math. But she couldn't tell Mr. Solomon how sick she was without talking. And whatever happened, she wasn't going to talk. "All right, class, get out your math books," Mrs. Solomon said when the spelling tests had been collected. Cynthia began to pray, keeping her eyes fastened on the classroom door. Dear God, please make something happen so that Lucy doesn't come to my class. She prayed so hard, she almost thought it might come true. Don't come, don't come, don't come. The door opened. Mr. Taylor led Lucy into the fifth grade room. Oh, Cynthia! Andy sang out. Yoo-hoo, Cynthia! Class, Cynthia's sister Lucy is going to be joining us for math and science because Mr. Taylor thinks she's ready to do fifth grade work in these subjects. Mrs. Solomon made the explanation as she steered Lucy over to the empty desk next to Andy's. Lucy looked like a small convict being led off to execution. Whatever excitement she might have felt about being promoted to fifth grade math had evaporated considerably under the glare of Cynthia's displeasure. Cynthia turned around once to look at Lucy, but it didn't make her feel any better to see the scared, miserable look on Lucy's face. She wasn't going to look again. They were doing decimals and math, which were like fractions, only harder. When Lucy's turn came, Cynthia's heart stopped, but Lucy got an easy one. 1/3 equals 0.33333, with the threes at the end stretching on forever, to infinity. Nobody snickered when she said it. It could have been any ordinary fifth grader giving an answer. Too soon it was Cynthia's turn. Cynthia, what fraction is .125? It was the hardest decimal so far, but Cynthia knew the answer. .125 was the same as 1/8. She was sure she was one of the few kids who knew that, and it broke her heart not to answer. She looked down at her desk. Just think a minute, Cynthia. What's .1? It's 1/10, Cynthia could have shouted, but she didn't give in. Lucy must be wondering what was going on. Maybe she was wondering why Cynthia, who seemed so smart at home, wasn't smart at all at school. But Cynthia tried not to think about the spy in the back row. She concentrated on how red her blood had looked, welling up from her stabbed finger. Mrs. Solomon shook her head. Yesterday you wouldn't stop talking. Today I can't get a word out of you. Maybe Monday we could have a happy medium? When Cynthia still didn't answer, Mrs. Solomon returned to decimals. Doug, what's .125? 1/8. Cynthia gritted her teeth. How dare he know her answer to the hardest decimal so far? She looked over at Joanne, who held up her hands, clasped together in a prize-fighter's gesture of victory. Solomon, as predicted, was cracking under the strain of Cynthia's silence. The time was coming for pleading, for humble supplication. Cynthia, please talk, I beg of you, she imagined Mrs. Solomon saying. Well, maybe she'd talk again, and maybe she wouldn't. Solomon's punishment was to have been a full year of silence, not one puny day that wasn't even over yet. Oh, Lucy, Cynthia heard from the back of the room. Lucy Goosey. And Andy made honking noises, presumably in imitation of geese. Mrs. Solomon heard them too. Andy, leave Lucy alone. She's our guest and we want to make her feel welcome. Cynthia didn't look back to see what was happening. If Lucy didn't like being picked on by the fifth grade boys, she shouldn't have come into fifth grade math. Out of the corner of her eye, Cynthia saw the plastic vomit making its way, boy by boy, back to Andy's desk. She happened to know that Lucy hated plastic vomit more than anything in the world. The sight of any kind of vomit was enough to make Lucy throw up on the spot, and the plastic vomit was made to look especially disgusting. Andy had gone too far. Picking on someone was one thing, plastic vomit was another, and the last thing Cynthia needed was her fourth grade sister throwing up in her class. Briskly, without a word, she got up from her chair and strode to the back of the room. She reached Andy's desk at the same time as the plastic vomit. She grabbed for it. Andy grabbed. A tug of war began. Cynthia, what's going on? Mrs. Solomon asked. Cynthia didn't answer, and she didn't let go. Either Mrs. Solomon would march to the back of the room and see for herself, or else Cynthia would wrest the vomit from Andy and bring it up to show her, displaying it in wordless triumph. Instead, Andy wrested the vomit from Cynthia and stowed it in his desk. Give that back, Cynthia wanted to yell. Teacher, teacher, he has plastic vomit in his desk, and as soon as you turn around, he's going to throw it at my sister. Andrew, what's the problem with you two? I was just sitting here, Miss Solomon, minding my own business when she came and tried to grab my math paper away from me. He said it so angelically that Mrs. Solomon knew it was a lie. It didn't look like a math paper to me, Andrew. Cynthia, what were you trying to take from him? Cynthia set her mouth stubbornly. Mrs. Solomon sighed. Take your seat, Cynthia. Now, Cynthia. Andy grinned, and Cynthia saw him slip his hand inside his desk again. We're all waiting for you, Cynthia. Life is full of hard choices, and this was one of them. Lucy looked like a trapped mouse waiting to be eaten by a snake. Either way, Andy would win. If he threw the plastic vomit at Lucy, he would win. If he made Cynthia talk, he would win. Cynthia could let him win by walking back to her seat and doing nothing, or she could let him win by doing plenty. She began walking back to her seat, purposefully enough so that Mr. Solomon thought she had given in. The teacher turned to the blackboard. Out came the plastic vomit one last time. Give me that vomit, Cynthia yelled. Caught off guard, Andy hesitated an instant too long. The next thing he knew, Cynthia had pounced, seized his treasure, and was brandishing it high above his head. Carrying her trophy gingerly between two fingers, she proceeded to the teacher's desk and laid it before her with half a flourish, half a shudder. Here, she said, this is the math paper I was trying to take from Andy before he could throw it at my sister. Andrew, see me after school, Mrs. Solomon said, wearily, trying not to take direct notice of the thing on her desk. And Cynthia, go sit down now, please. Cynthia gazed once around the room before returning to her seat. Meg and Joanne looked disappointed. The vow in blood that it was to have lasted till June hadn't lasted till 1:30. Lucy looked grateful, awed by her sister's ferocity and courage. Doug looked gloating. Andy looked like he missed his vomit and wished he had it back again. And Mrs. Solomon looked defeated. Which, after all, had been the whole reason for the vow in the first place, hadn't it? Chapter 3. A sunny Saturday morning followed the plastic vomit incident. The trees outside Cynthia's window tossed bright squares of morning light back and forth across her white tufted coverlet. Cynthia woke up ahead of Lucy and tried to slip downstairs very quietly, so her sister wouldn't stir. Getting up first made her feel superior. To think that she could read half a book before Lucy even got out of bed! Lucy was a light sleeper, though, and usually she heard Cynthia tiptoeing down the hall and came to join her. It wasn't worth sleeping late if Cynthia acted so smug about it. That morning Cynthia managed to steal downstairs alone. Her parents, both early risers, were lingering over their second cups of coffee. Good morning, little bird number 1, Mr. Thornton said. Where's little bird number 2? Sleeping. Mr. and Mrs. Thornton exchanged an amused look. They thought it was comical for anyone to sleep past 6:30. Do you want your eggs now, or do you want to wait for Lucy? Mrs. Thornton asked. Cynthia knew she was supposed to say that she'd wait for Lucy, since scrambling 2 eggs separately was twice as much work as scrambling them together. Then a wonderful idea popped into her head. I could have breakfast at Burgerland. It was only 2 blocks away, and for $1 she could have sausage and eggs on a buttery, soft biscuit, or an apple Danish with warm frosting melting down all over it. When Lucy's up, you can go together, Mrs. Thornton promised. Naturally, one couldn't go unless both did, but it was so much more exciting than breakfast at home that Cynthia's heart burst into song. She scooped up a stack of clean sheets from the linen closet and clattered back upstairs, this time taking care to make as much noise as possible. Before she had finished stripping last week's sheets off her bed, Lucy appeared in the doorway, dressed in the same pink-striped nightshirt, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Breakfast at Burgerland, Cynthia announced, watching her sister's face. At first Lucy just stood there, letting her eyes get used to the sunlight dancing on the bleached white floorboards. Then the words registered. Burgerland? Cynthia nodded, as pleased as if she had thought up the outing as a surprise for Lucy. I'm going to have an apple Danish heated up in the microwave. I'm going to have scrambled eggs and a sausage patty and a biscuit on the side. In an instant Lucy had flown downstairs for her own sheets, and was attacking her bed with vigor. Cynthia finished first, so she helped Lucy pull her sheets and blankets even on both sides and tuck them in. She liked Saturday mornings so much that she even liked doing housework. Outside the window, she could already see her parents' pale purple sheets flapping on the clothesline. "Let's vacuum after breakfast," Lucy said. Cynthia's answer was to begin tugging on the green pants and brown pullover her mother had laid out the night before. 5 minutes later, hair combed, faces washed, they presented themselves in the front foyer to collect their dollars. Mr. Thornton gave Cynthia a $5 bill. "Get whatever you want," he said. The girls waited for what they hoped he would say next. "Keep the change." Cynthia felt so happy that, try as she might, she couldn't feel mad at Lucy for spoiling everything the day before. That was what a sunny Saturday morning did for her. Outside, the sky was a soft, clear, cloudless blue, and the leaves of the maple trees were just starting to turn gold at the tips. "I might have hot cakes and sausage instead," she said. "I might have 2 biscuits on the side with mine," Lucy said. Poplar Avenue, where the Thorntons lived, was a tree-shaded street of 3-story Victorian houses with generous wraparound porches and fanciful gingerbread trim. It ran into Elm Street, which was lined with modern ranch houses, each with an attached 2-car garage. The houses on Elm cost more than the houses on Poplar because they were brand new, with wall-to-wall carpet and dishwashers and built-in microwave ovens. But the Thorntons thought Poplar Avenue was much nicer. Instead of a dishwasher, they had a real stained glass window on the second-story landing of the wide front staircase. The window was like a purple and orange lily, with fire trapped inside. Around the corner from Elm was the busy main street where the traffic guard stood on weekday mornings to make sure the children crossed safely at the light. He wasn't there on Saturdays, but it didn't matter since they didn't have to cross the street to get to Burgerland. From the first glimpse of its low red roof, the girls began walking faster and faster, until finally they had broken into a sprint and were laughing at themselves for running. "I'll have an apple Danish with—" Cynthia hastily scanned the menu board, though she knew it by heart. "With a side order of sausage and a side order of hash browns and a milk and an orange juice." Lucy stuck by her original order. "For here or to go?" the counter girl asked. "For here." Cynthia paid. They had a lot less change left over than they thought they would, and they carried their 2 groaning trays over to a booth by the front window. Too late, Cynthia saw Andy McLean sprawling comfortably in the booth right next to theirs, his dirty sneakers on the freshly wiped table. One by one he was tearing the tops off all the packages of granulated sugar and emptying their contents into his mouth. 2 grown-ups who looked like long-suffering parents had just joined the food line. "Let's move," Cynthia whispered urgently. Lucy didn't ask why, but picked up her tray to follow. Cynthia led the way to the only other free table, wishing it weren't so close. She wished it even more when the sound of raucous singing burst forth from Andy's booth. He was using the tune of an old English folk song they had learned in music class, "Green Sleeves." But instead of green sleeves, he was singing green pants. Since he didn't remember many of the words, he sang the same ones over and over again. "Green pants was all my joy. Green pants, green pants, green pants, green pants." He sang it loudly enough so that people from the other tables turned around to look. And there Cynthia and Lucy sat, wearing homemade green pants that made them look like caterpillars struggling out of badly fitting cocoons. Of all the clothes Mrs. Thornton had made them, the pants were the worst. They sagged down "in the crotch," as their mother would say. Usually the word sent them laughing uncontrollably, but thinking of it now, Cynthia felt her face flush a dull brick red. And the green was such a bright, noticeable green. And nothing could be more noticeable than 2 girls sitting together at Burgerland, both wearing them. The song ended when Andy's parents, mystified by the sudden concert, returned to the table. Cynthia took a bite of her apple Danish, but it tasted the way a wadded sheet of notebook paper had tasted when she tried to eat it once as a joke. "Boys are awful," Lucy said. Cynthia shook her head. "No, it's the clothes. The clothes are awful." She took another bite of Danish and shoved the styrofoam plate away. I don't see why everything has to be the same, she burst out. Because it's fair, Lucy replied, but Cynthia had already known the answer. It was their mother's reason for everything. It was the reason she made their clothes in the first place. She had given up hunting through the department store racks to find two identical everythings, one in Cynthia's size and one in Lucy's. And until this year the girls had liked having matching clothes. Dressing alike had been part of the fun of being sisters. But neither dressing alike nor being sisters was as much fun for Cynthia any more. We could tell her. Lucy waited expectantly, but Cynthia's voice trailed off. Their mother had gone to so much trouble to be fair. It would break her heart if, after all, she had only made the girls unhappy. But we have to do something, Cynthia said finally. I mean, we can't still be dressing alike when we're 90. Not now that you're in my class. Cynthia had thought that Lucy might have the grace to look guilty, but her sister was busy thinking. Cynthia liked to write sonnets about problems, but Lucy liked to solve them. Okay, here's an idea. What if we brought other clothes to school with us and changed on the way? Where? In the bushes. You know, in that little park. What if it rains? No, I have it. Right here at Burgerland, in the ladies' room. And then we can change back on the way home. And we won't hurt her feelings, Cynthia finished triumphantly. She took a big bite of her hash browns, but they had gotten cold. They had almost $1 left. I'm getting some more hash browns. Is there enough for me to get another biscuit? Cynthia counted again. With 2 cents left over. The second breakfast tasted better than the first. Andy was gone, and the new plan had been launched. The trees that lined the Burgerland lot tossed their branches in the bright September breeze. Cynthia felt in her pants pocket for the stubby pencil she always carried with her. I have to write a poem, she told Lucy. Lucy went on calmly spreading strawberry jam on her biscuit. She was used to her sister's flashes of poetic inspiration. There was no paper handy, so Cynthia smoothed out her crumpled napkin. The pencil point could have been sharper, but it would do. She knew the poem would be a 17-syllable Japanese haiku, and she knew it would be about how happy she was, and about how somehow her happiness was connected to the tree branches dancing outside the window. But that was all she knew. The rest would have to come. The trees are dancing. That was the first line. Without counting the syllables, she knew it had the right number, 5. She looked at the trees more closely. Like the maple outside her bedroom window at home, the leaves were just beginning to turn. The tips of the branches were golden, as if they had been dipped in sunlight. There, she had it. The trees are dancing. Sunlight dances on the trees. My heart dances too. She would copy it into her notebook as soon as they got home. Over the sound of the vacuum, Cynthia hadn't heard the phone ring. They were bickering over whose turn it was to put the vacuum cleaner away when Mrs. Thornton came upstairs to tell them. The Northridge bookstore called, girls. The books you ordered are here. She said it casually, as if they ordered books every day. But that she had made a special trip upstairs to tell them showed that she knew how important these particular books were. If you've finished vacuuming, you can take a walk down to get them, or Daddy and I'll drive you this afternoon when you get back from the library. We'll walk, Cynthia said quickly. They'd get the books sooner that way. She and Lucy reached for the vacuum cleaner at the same time, forgetting to care about who had lugged it downstairs last Saturday. They had been bitterly disappointed a month ago when they had taken their birthday money down to the Northridge bookstore, planning to buy their two favorite books. It was going to be the first time ever that Cynthia and Lucy had bought hardcover books with their own money. But when they told the bookstore lady which books they wanted, she said that the books would have to be special ordered. The bookstore didn't have them in stock, not a single copy of either one. It would take 4 to 6 weeks, the lady said, for the books to arrive. 4 to 6 weeks. It seemed so far away that it was hardly worth looking forward to. But now the weeks had passed and the books were here. The bookstore was downtown, in between an old-fashioned drugstore and a 5 and 10. Cynthia liked the stores downtown a lot more than the stores in the shopping mall. One had bins of nickel candy like gummy bears and Tootsie Rolls and hard candy dots, matching 4 abreast down long, narrow strips of paper. How they stuck onto the paper, Cynthia didn't know. Another store sold tiny sample-sized bottles of shampoo and shaving lotion. any toiletry item you could think of, in miniature. But the Northridge bookstore was the best. The bookstore lady had a big, gentle dog who looked as if he would die for love when the girls patted him. And the store smelled of books, new books, the kind that made you want to press your nose flat up against the paper and smell till you almost felt dizzy from it. The dog's name was Chuzzy. He was named after a book by Charles Dickens, Martin Chuzzlewit. When they pushed open the bookstore door after their long, hot walk, Chuzzy greeted Cynthia and Lucy with a hard, frantic thump of his tail. He acted happy to see any customers, but the girls always thought he looked especially happy to see them. That was fast, girls, the bookstore lady said, recognizing them from their last visit. Did you remember to bring your money? Of course they had. They had checked their pockets twice before leaving for the reassuring feel of the folded envelopes with the crisp bills tucked inside. But the question made them check again. They nodded. They saw the books on the lady's desk right next to the cash register. The large book was on the bottom and the smaller book on top. Who gets which? The lady asked. Mine's The Stars by H.A. Ray, Lucy said. Mine's Someday You'll Write by Elizabeth Yates. It was the small one, smaller than a usual library book. It was just the right size to tuck into a day pack, together with a pad of paper and a bundle of sharpened pencils and an apple and some fig Newtons. Lucy was already looking at hers, checking all her favorite drawings to make sure they were there. Shyly, Cynthia opened hers to the first page and read the wonderful opening sentences that promised everything that was to come. You say you want to be a writer some day, that you dream of being one. But you know, as well as I do, that we cannot dream ourselves into being anything. We can, though, through work and acceptance of the discipline, shape ourselves into being what we want to be. The lady rang the books up one at a time. Since Lucy's book was so much bigger than Cynthia's, she had to put it in an ordinary brown paper bag. But for Cynthia's, she found a smaller bag made of fine grained white paper, like wrapping paper, covered with garlands of purple violets. It was the prettiest store bag Cynthia had ever seen. Violets for the poet, the lady said, handing it to her, smiling. Clutching their bags, the girls patted Chuzzy goodbye and started on their way home. Violets for the poet, Cynthia repeated dreamily. Brown paper bag for the astronomer, Lucy said, trying to sound just as starry-eyed. Do you think that through work and acceptance of the discipline, we can shape ourselves into being what we want to be? Yes, Lucy said automatically, since that seemed to be the answer expected. I mean, what? Do you think I'll really be a writer and you'll really be an astronomer? Oh, that, Lucy said. Of course we will. Chapter 4. When Cynthia and Lucy left for school Monday morning, dressed alike in red plaid skirts and white blouses, their matching green knapsacks had matching soft bulges. And Cynthia's, folded up next to her math book and Anne of Green Gables, was Lucy's brown jumper. Lucy's knapsack hid the brown striped shirt that went with it. I can't wait to see how we'll look, Cynthia said as they dashed into the ladies' room at Burgerland. It was a two-stall restroom. The outside door had no lock on it, so Lucy had to change in one of the stalls. Cynthia handed her the clothes over the top of the door, hoping no one from school would wander in during the transformation. In a minute it was complete. Lucy emerged in the brown outfit, and the lookalike clothes were folded up as neatly as could be managed and tucked back into the knapsacks. For the first time they could remember, they were wearing different clothes. It feels strange, Cynthia said, staring at their reflections in the restroom mirror. Our hair is still the same. It was hard to tell if Lucy sounded disappointed or relieved. We can fix that. Do you have a rubber band? Lucy fumbled in the bottom of her knapsack and found a rather soiled and gummy one. Cynthia produced another and then did an awkward job of braiding Lucy's hair into two plaits. The part in the back was pretty crooked, but they'd be late if she started all over again. Ta-da! She pronounced the job done. No one would suspect we were even related. Since they were in danger of being late, they shrugged on their knapsacks and hurried out, even though Cynthia had scraped together enough change for them to split an order of hash browns. They didn't run into any friends on the way, so they wouldn't know till they reached the playground how the other kids would react. Cynthia and Lucy both felt the change was so momentous that they half expected astonished stares from passing strangers. Cynthia imagined the sensation they would cause at school. But when they walked up together, blushing and almost bursting with self-consciousness, no one said a thing. No one even seemed to notice. "Cynthia!" Meg and Joanne pounced on her. "Guess what?" "What?" "Guess whose house we walked by yesterday after school?" Meg asked. "I don't know. Andy's or Doug's?" "Doug's. And guess what we saw hanging on his clothesline?" Joanne continued. Cynthia took a wild guess. "His clothes?" Both screamed the answer together. "His underwear!" Across the playground, Lucy was swept up into a crowd of noisy, laughing fourth graders. Cynthia felt the way she did on Halloween, when she expected everyone to be amazed that a ferocious witch was walking down the street. But none of the goblins and Draculas looked at her twice because they all had costumes too. The real test would come in math, though, when Lucy would once again have to make her grand entrance into the fifth grade room, all eyes upon her. At the thought of math, Cynthia felt the old throbbing anger pounding in her stomach. She and Lucy had been allies back in the Burgerland bathroom, but, dressed alike or not dressed alike, she didn't want Lucy to be in her class. After lunch, Cynthia was almost frantic with dread and anxiety as she had been on Friday. Promptly at 1, the door poked open. Mr. Solomon had told Lucy that she didn't need to knock, and Lucy crept in to take her seat in the back. Except for one half-hearted "Yoo-hoo, Cynthia!" from Andy, her arrival caused no commotion. She answered questions just like anyone else and didn't speak unless she was called on. Cynthia was limp with relief when Lucy finally tiptoed out at the end of science, but the relief was mixed with an odd and unaccountable disappointment. It was almost as if, in switching clothes, both she and Lucy had become somehow invisible. She wrote a note to Meg and folded it into a small, plump triangle, with the ends tucked neatly inside. When Solomon wasn't looking, she dropped it on the floor and gave it a good hard kick so that it slid over to Meg's purple running shoes. The note said, "I'm bored. Are you? I feel like throwing the window pole out the window." Meg wrote something on the bottom, and the note came sliding back. "Do it," it said. Cynthia felt as if she had just gotten a transfusion, as if bright, sparkling ginger ale were surging through her veins instead of blood. It was 20 minutes to 3. School would be dismissed for the day in 5 minutes. There was little time to waste. Luckily, the window pole happened to be propped up next to a wide open window, directly across from Cynthia's desk. "Now," Meg mouthed, twisting around in her chair. Up Cynthia hopped. She glanced quickly out the window to make sure the coast was clear. Then she seized the window pole, it was heavier than she had thought it would be, and heaved it onto the lawn 2 stories below. The class exploded into pandemonium. Cynthia was back in her seat before Solomon could figure out what had happened, but of course the boys told. They all told, shouting out in unison, "Cynthia threw the window pole out the window!" "What on earth?" Solomon began, but the pole was indisputably gone, and when she glanced out the window to the lawn below, sure enough, there it lay. Solomon was at a loss for words. "What, dare I ask, possessed you to do such a thing?" Cynthia shrugged. "I felt like it." "You felt like it," Mr. Solomon repeated acidly. "Well, now kindly feel like going down there and retrieving it, and then kindly feel like stopping by Mr. McGuire's office and explaining it to him." The bell rang, but Cynthia knew better than to think that would make a difference to Solomon. This part was going to be a lot less fun. With all the other children already streaming out to the playground, there would be no audience should she feel like pretending the window pole was a javelin. Besides, Lucy would be waiting, and Cynthia wasn't in the mood to explain the window pole escapade to Lucy. Slowly she trudged down the stairs to get it. As she was heading out the front door, she almost bumped into Mr. Tollins, the school janitor, who was coming in. He was carrying a window pole. "Kids!" he snorted, shaking his head. "I ask you, what kind of kid would pull a stunt like this?" "A bad kid," he said, answering his own question. "No good." "Well, maybe they were just trying to be funny," Cynthia suggested. "Funny!" the janitor shouted. He was an excitable man who used his hands when he talked, and the window pole was twitching about wildly. "Someone walks by and the window pole hits him in the head. Poop! He's dead. And that's funny?" Idle chit-chat obviously wasn't going to get Mr. Tollins to surrender the window pole, Cynthia decided. And like Dorothy with the witch's broomstick in Oz, she had to have it before she could go home. "It was a boy in my class who did it," she said, "and Mrs. Solomon asked if I would please go down and get it, to save her a trip." She reached for the pole tentatively, since Mr. Tollins was still waving it about. He'd have no trouble pretending it was a javelin, but the janitor didn't hand it over. And besides, it wasn't going to hit anybody in the head anyway. The boy in my class checked first. "Where is this boy?" Mr. Tollins demanded. "Why isn't he here to get it?" "He's busy. He's busy being punished." "I'll punish him. What class are you in?" "Mrs. Solomon's." It was getting worse and worse. She thought about thanking Mr. Tollins for taking the pole back upstairs for her, and then running home as fast as she could. But it was extremely unlikely that the whole thing would be forgotten by morning. Cynthia tried to pretend that it was just her body that was climbing the stairs in step with Mr. Tollins. Her mind, her true self, had flown away, far away, to some tropical island. "There you are," Mrs. Solomon said severely when the two of them appeared in the classroom doorway. "I take it that Mr. McGuire was no more pleased than I was at such a display of irresponsible behavior. Thank you, Mr. Tollins, but I wanted Cynthia to bring the pole in all by herself." "Boy!" Mr. Tollins exploded, glaring at Cynthia. She wished he would put the window pole back where it belonged, or at least stop gesturing with it. "You did go see Mr. McGuire, didn't you?" Mr. Solomon asked. If Mr. Tollins hadn't been there, she might have thought of something, but frankly, she was tired of thinking. Not exactly. Mr. Tollins came along and then." Mrs. Solomon sighed. "Where do you children get these ideas?" "All right, go on home, Cynthia, but I want you to know my patience is limited, and I can't vouch for how much of it is left where you're concerned." Before she could hear what else Mr. Tollins might have to say, Cynthia was out of the room, down the stairs, and outside. Lucy was waiting for her at the corner. "Sorry I'm late," Cynthia said. "I had to help Solomon with some stuff. You know what happened in my class? We were just sitting there waiting for the bell to ring when a window pole went sailing by the window. A window pole, just like Michael Bailey." "You're kidding," Cynthia said. "Well, I guess we'd better get to Burgerland and change. It'll be my turn to change tomorrow." By the middle of the week, it seemed as if they had been changing clothes in Burgerland all of their lives. No one else noticed until lunchtime on Wednesday, when Meg, looking at Lucy across the cafeteria, then at Cynthia, and then back at Lucy, suddenly said, "I thought you two always dressed alike." "Not always," Cynthia said. "I thought it was your mother's big thing," Joanne said, as if to side with Meg against her. Cynthia shrugged. "She's real busy this year now that she's teaching. What color did you say Doug's underwear was that time you saw it hanging on the line?" "White mostly," Joanne said, "except one pair was blue." She shrieked with laughter. Meg and Cynthia joined in, and that was the end of the conversation about dressing alike. There were two tricky aspects to changing clothes that the girls hadn't thought about ahead of time. One was that they had to make sure they always walked home alone, so they could keep the switch a secret from the other kids at school. But Lucy's best friend Dana had moved away during the summer, and lately Joanne went to Meg's every afternoon. Cynthia could have joined them if she had wanted, but another one of their mother's rules was that they weren't supposed to accept after-school invitations unless both sisters were included. Cynthia let Lucy tag along if they were just going to play Monopoly or Clue, but if they were going to have any real conversation, it spoiled things if a fourth grader was there. So she and Lucy usually walked home by themselves anyway. The other problem was what to do with their clothes after they got home. The spare clothes that one of them had worn all day had to be smoothed out carefully and hung back up in the closet, and one of the original matching outfits had to be rescued from the clothes hamper to be tucked into their knapsacks another day. The plan depended on keeping the spare clothes neat and clean, so that when their mother laid them out later she wouldn't notice that they had been worn already. It also depended on Mrs. Thornton's being too busy during the week to sort through the clothes hamper. There were so many ways in which the plan could go wrong that Cynthia's stomach hurt just thinking about them. But not dressing alike was worth a stomachache. Gradually, Cynthia got used to having Lucy in her class. The only difference it made was that she behaved herself perfectly while Lucy was there, and usually managed to get into some kind of trouble as soon as Lucy had scurried away. One day she blew up a balloon and popped it with a loud, satisfying bang. Another day she squirted Andy with a water pistol. "Does it make you feel strange to have your sister come for math?" Joanne asked once when they were waiting to choose sides for kickball. "Sort of, a little bit. It's like she's younger, but she's better than you at math." Joanne meant it sympathetically, since her brother, 2 years younger, was already better than she was at baseball. Joanne could never get over the injustice of it. But Cynthia was so flabbergasted that Joanne could think that was why she minded that she answered sharply, "Who said she was better? We're both getting A's, you know." "But," Joanne's voice trailed off uncertainly, "she's only in the fourth grade." Cynthia's name was called, and she went to join her team. Of course Lucy was better at math. That was the whole idea. Lucy was better at math and science. Cynthia was better at English and social studies. Lucy had to be good at math if she was going to be an astronomer, just as Cynthia had to be good at writing if she was going to be a writer. Who would want to be good at all the same things? It would be so boring. There would be no point in being good at things if everyone else in the world was good at them too.